Okay, members, we'll resume at item number 43. These are statements on the substantive interim reports of the Farley Commission of Investigation. We have 145 minutes for this important piece of business, and we'll begin by hearing the Minister of State at the Department of Health, Minister Anne Rabbitte, and you have 20 minutes, Minister, if you wish.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle, and thank you for the opportunity to update the House on the work being carried out by the Commission of Investigation into certain matters relative to disability services in the South East and related matters, also known as the Farley Commission. At the outset, I think it's important to say that I'm mindful that this is an active Commission of investigation and that the Commission is entirely independent in the conduct of its investigations, and it would not be appropriate for me to make comment on the substance of reports at this time, as I do not wish to interfere with or prejudice the Commission's ongoing investigation. For context, in May 2017, the Commission of Investigation was established to investigate the care and protection of Grace, a pseudonym, and others in a former foster home in the South East, which has been the subject of abuse allegations. It was given two bodies of work, Phase 1 and Phase 2, to be carried out over a 12-month period. Phase 1, which began on the 15th of May 2017, was concerned with investigating the role of public authorities in the care and protection of Grace, who resided with her foster family in the South East of Ireland between 1989 and 1995. Phase 2 will then take into account the facts established through Phase 1 of its work and the scope for any further investigations. As the House will be aware, 4 12-month extensions have been granted to allow Phase 1 of its work to be completed in accordance with the terms of reference. Since taking up the role of Minister for Disability, I have met with the Commission on 2 occasions. Most recently, I met with members of the Commission in May 2021. Having watched this from opposition in the last Dáil, I thought it was important to proactively engage with the Commission as far as possible, which is why I sought these meetings. I needed to understand fully the reason the Commission work is taking as long as it is, and to hear from the Commission directly on the matters. I don't think it's in anyone's surprise that both Minister for Health and I were very disappointed to learn that the Commission needed more time to conclude its work. All options were considered, but being honest with the House, Ceann Comhairle, where would we be if the Commission was scrapped? We'd have spent €7 million and have no final report to show for it. This is no use to anyone. No lessons could be learned. We need to ensure this final report can be drafted and submitted to Government so that we have a true understanding of what events occurred and where exact there were failures in Grace's care. There needs to be accountability. We need to know exactly what happened and who was responsible for any failures that may be uncovered by the Commission. I would hope that when the Commission's full findings are eventually published, we will all have answers to these important questions, as well as recommendations for the future. In granting the most recent 12-month extension in July 2021, account of the progress made is providing the 2 substantive interim reports. An outline of work still to be carried out was taken into consideration. Without a doubt, Phase 1 has taken longer than any of us could ever have anticipated. From what the Commission told me when we met, there has been a substantial number of interviews, agencies and correspondence to be considered by the Commission. I know from my discussion with the Commission that they too are aware of the time their work is taking up. Of course, the current public health emergency has also had an effect on the ability to conduct investigations, and this too has had a knock-on effect. The first substantive interim report covers the period 1989 to 1996, at which point Grace reached adulthood. During this time, state childcare policies governed the responsibility of public authorities regarding her care. It also informs us of the methodology and the context of the Commission's investigation. The first interim report also includes the role of public authorities in Grace's care and protection, the arrangements whereby her foster home was identified and used, statutory checks and duties of care responsibilities, and how the relevant public authorities interacted on her care during this period. The second substantive interim report represents findings by the Commission on a range of matters relating to the role of public authorities in the care and protection of Grace over the period 1997 to 2007. The substantive interim reports represents the first findings by the Farley Commission. There is an opportunity now to engage with the relevant organisations and care providers to discuss the findings, the evolution of care in the interim, and confirm that we have addressed the circumstances which enabled this situation to arise in the first place. However, the work of the Commission has yet to conclude on a number of important issues relating to Grace. In particular, we are awaiting its findings in relation to the care provided by Grace by the foster family and whether she suffered abuse. This is one of the most important issues to be considered by the Commission, and there is a significant interest in its resolution. Both I and the Minister for Health are continuing to consider the two substantive reports and are keeping the work of the Commission under review. It is also important to note that the regular progress updates towards the completion of Phase 1 are ongoing within the Department of Health. I must say that in discussing this issue here today, I cannot ignore the fact that I have in recent months raised an issue on failures in care in a HSE-run service in Donegal. In that instance, the HSE's own National Independent Review Panel, or NIRP, carried out a review of abuse allegations at a facility. Its findings are detailed in a so-called Brandon report. I know this was discussed earlier during leaders' questions, so it is timely in that regard. The NIRP reported identified 108 occurrences of sexually inappropriate behaviour by one resident, referred to as the pseudonym Brandon, towards 18 other residents in the facility between 2003 and 2011. The NIRP's purpose was to review the governance arrangements in the facility and understand why this situation has continued over a period of 4 years without any effective action being taken by management during Brandon's residency to stop and prevent these highly traumatic assaults. I mentioned this again here as having read the full Brandon report, and it would appear there are echoes of failures in care discussed today that cannot be overlooked regarding the findings of the Brandon report. The report itself notes that these incidents occurred with the full knowledge of staff and management of the facility at that time. The full Brandon report provides a detailed overview of what happened, where the processes failed, and how these incidents occurred. I believe the NIRP process provides clear answers, but its full findings need to be public, as Minister Coveney mentioned himself earlier. The safety and protection of vulnerable people in the care of the state is paramount, and when issues such as these arise, we need to approach them with the fullest sense of openness and transparency. The Government's first concern is to ensure that the needs of the current service users are being prioritised and addressed. Whether regarding the matters being investigated by the Farley Commission or those detailed in the Brandon report, it is imperative that lessons are learned and timely improvements made where needed in the system. I will also use this opportunity to once again ask the HSE to reconsider its position on the Brandon report and publish it in full, and not just the executive summary. Why they will not shift their position is beyond me, and I would hope they will reconsider. I know some deputies present here today, and indeed former members of this House, have been closely involved in bringing these events into the public domain and are keen to see the Commission's work progress and its ultimate findings published. And I look forward to listening to other contributions here today. But I am acutely aware of the sensitivities and the timely manner for action on this. Thank you, Ken Corley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rabbitt. Now, who's speaking for Sinn Féin on this matter? Deputy David Cullinan.
I'm sharing time, I think, with some of my deputies, or one of my colleagues, I should say, Cian Corla. Minister, Grace was failed by the state and by individuals in charge of her care. 46 others went through this home, and it is welcome that all of their cases will be fully investigated. Grace was failed by the South Eastern Health Board, and she was failed by a system that did not have adequate safeguarding laws and processes in place. Red flags were raised, but went ignored and unactioned. And I have to say there's a lot of parallels with the branding case that you raised as well, and I would echo your view that the report needs to be published and its executive findings, but also not just published, but also given to the families of all of the victims as well, because they need to be front and centre. And what happened in the Grace case was either gross incompetence or someone did not want to know, and we should not hold back in calling that out. One of the things that we need to make sure, and one of the changes that I want to see in this area, and I have been championing advances in adult safeguarding for some time, but there has to be accountability at an organisational level. And that, I have to say, has to include sanctions, because we cannot have a situation, whether it's a public care home or whether it's in a home or whether it's in a centre for people with disabilities or whether it's a child that has been fostered out, if there is abuse and neglect and there has been systemic failures and awareness of those failures, there has to be accountability at an organisational level, from the very top right down to who is responsible for those failings. And people want to see that type of accountability brought into this area. Concerns of abuse were raised as far back as 1993, yet Grace remained in the home for a further 16 years. Concerns were never raised with her mother, who has yet, I believe, to receive an apology which she can accept. And I remember I was a member of the Public Accounts Committee for some time, and we had the former Director General of the HSE at the time before the PAC, and he refused to give an apology on the basis that he wanted to see what the Farley Commission would report back on. But we all knew at that time, and we still know, that there was systemic failings. Obviously, we need to get and establish the full facts, and this is what this commission will do. But there was certainly enough awareness for that apology to be given, and yet that mother is still waiting for an apology from the HSE. She was misled, in my view, all along the way. She was told that Grace was happy, that she was attending daycare, that she was in a loving, caring home, and as we know, none of this was true. A number of failures have been identified in the substantive interim reports of the Farley Commission, and I do want to, of course, acknowledge that no finding has been made yet in terms of those interim reports, but the following failures have been clearly identified: ignorance or a lack of knowledge of legal responsibilities and guidelines by key staff involved in managing Grace's care; failure to remove Grace from the home after concerns were raised and to even investigate those complaints; repeated evidence of injury to Grace with no evidence of investigation of unusual industries; a failure to secure her legal status once she turned 18; a failure to ensure she received regular medical attention; ignorance of her generally poor appearance and hygiene; failure to monitor, review and supervise Grace in her placement; failure to maintain a case file; failure to designate an authorised officer to oversee her case; extended periods with no health visits or a key worker on the case; and overall a general failure to ensure her safety and well-being and to protect her. And that's already damning, even before we see whatever findings will come from the final report. And even after a disclosure was made from a disability service provider, who I've engaged with several times on this issue, most particularly when we were dealing with this on the Public Accounts Committee, as others in the Chamber have as well, they were raising serious concerns about Grace's condition and behaviour, and yet she was left in the home without any investigation. The service provider even reported this to the PAC when Dr McGuinness was chair of the PAC at the time, and that they felt that their funding was targeted because they came forward. And that's also a very, very serious issue, and also something that I personally and others raised with the Director General of the HSE, that an organisation that was receiving state funding and was raising concerns and whistleblowing, if you want to call it that, felt that they were then targeted because of the work that they did in bringing this issue to the public attention. And this is why, and I'll finish on this because my colleagues will come in, it is that type of institutional resistance, failure to take responsibility, failure to deal with complaints which are made, failure to follow up on complaints, failure to make sure that proper safeguarding is in place, is why we end up with these type of commissions of investigation, which need to be put in place to establish the facts. But if we had accountability at an organisational level, if we had honesty and truth from those in power, we wouldn't have to have the high volume of these type of commissions that we're seeing. Grace was failed by the HSE, obviously by the family involved, and by people within the HSE, and whatever happens, people need to be held to account for those failures.
Thank you very much, Count Corla. Systemic failure and shortcomings, a failure to monitor, review and supervise, numerous and notable warning signs, she disappeared from view. These are just some of the devastating findings from the 2 interim reports of the Farley Commission of Investigation. Running to nearly 800 pages, both interim reports map out in significant detail the breathtaking failures of a system that was meant to protect a vulnerable person. There have been reviews, investigations and a number of inquiries over 2 decades, and what seems evident from this wealth of information and investigation is that Grace was being systemically abused and systemically failed over a prolonged period of time. Do we ever actually learn from history, I often wonder, and do we learn from past mistakes? To ask and to understand the reasons why systems designed by people to protect people fail so miserably. There is little doubt that the key personnel within the South Eastern Health Board at that time were outrageously inept in their roles and had little understanding of their duty of care towards Grace. To read that they actually had no real understanding in regard to the discharge of their duties in the care of Grace beggars belief, and I wonder at times, is it a convenient excuse as well? It essentially reads to me that Grace was placed in a wholly unacceptable foster placement and simply forgotten. Yet when staff and day services noted and reported disturbing behaviour, they were dismissed. Most worrying was the revelation that after an allegation of abuse, a decision to remove Grace was taken. However, this was reversed. What is really hard to read is that whatever failings Grace encountered as a minor not only continued, but escalated amid confusion over her legal status, abandonment by officials for years on end, and the fallout of the decision not to remove her from the foster home. The detailing of Grace's behaviour at this point is actually very distressing and very difficult to read. Compounding this was the fact that Grace could not articulate what she was suffering, she just suffered in silence. Recently I spoke about this issue on our local radio, and I said, and I feel I say this regularly in here, that I sometimes actually run out of words when it comes to children and the treatment of children by this state, both from a historical point of view and from present. And I really do wonder, you know, here we are again having another debate where we're all shocked and dismayed and concerned. I nearly can guarantee that in a few years' time something else is going to happen and we'll be having a similar debate in here. We really, really need to start putting the resources in place to ensure that this doesn't happen to other children and other vulnerable people. So concerned were Gardaí that they sent a file to the DPP in 2020 recommending prosecution, and I think I'm right in saying, although open to correction, that the DPP is still to decide on this case. I think we were all shocked to learn in May of this year that the Commission of Investigation's work was to expand to examine a further 46 others in the home and whether they were also abused. And to think that this went on for 20 years and could also impact 46 others is wholly and completely unacceptable. To say the state has an appalling record when it comes to the treatment of children is a depressing understatement. We look at marginal laundries, the mother and baby institutions, industrial schools. It, unfortunately, as I've said, seems that we don't ever appear to be able to learn any sort of lesson and make positive changes. I also hold huge reservations with the use of the Commission of Investigation format, and I do want to make that point, to properly investigate these abuses. To date, the investigation has cost $7 million. Imagine if only a tiny fraction of this money was channelled into providing vulnerable young people and adults like Grace with the care they so rightly deserve. And I think we've seen from the mother and baby home investigation how the Commission of Investigation system is not really fit for purpose, and we need as legislators to look at amending that. I sincerely hope that I never ever have to stand in this chamber and talk about a case of absolute dereliction of duty ever again, but unfortunately I wouldn't hold my breath in relation to that. It's imperative that any staff working with vulnerable adults clearly understand their role, the legal status of those in their care, particularly around wardship and guardianship, and that they're also held accountable in relation to their roles. That they're held responsible, and when they do have the courage in certain cases to come forward and talk about situations, that they're not then discriminated or dismissed for that. Thank you, Count Corla.
Well, Count Corla, Minister, we have a dark history of this state of neglect and abuse of some of our most vulnerable in society. I'm on the Children, Disability, Equality, Integration and New Committee with my colleague here, Kathleen Funchion, and in my short time on that committee, I've heard heartbreaking testimonies of those affected by the mother and babies homes and the real-life stories of those who were impacted by forced adoptions. I'm also very aware of the enduring pain inflicted on women and children in the Magdalen laundries and the industrial schools, and the list goes on, Minister. I could bring up other circumstances. And as a As a society, we must not forget our past, but we must learn from it. We must make amends to the people that the state failed and ensure that situations like this do not happen again. And I do welcome the opportunity to speak today on the Farley Commission and Grace. As was said already, Grace was failed by the state and by the people entrusted most to look after her. Grace was failed by the Southern Eastern Health Board, and she was failed by an inept system that did not have proper safeguarding measures in place. Concerns that Grace was abused were brought to the attention of the authorities. However, a decision made to remove her from a foster home was later reversed, and she remained. Grace, who cannot speak, was allowed to remain in a foster home by the health authorities despite suspicions of sexual and physical abuse. Allegations of sexual abuse were made by a former resident back in 1995. Red flags seem to be raised, Minister, and they were just ignored. 46 other children went through this home, and I also welcome that these cases will be investigated, because that's really needed. Concerns of abuse were raised as far as back as 1993 with Grace, and yet Grace remained in the home for a further 16 years. So 16 years, Minister, I'll just let that sink in a small bit. It's 16 years that the state left an intellectually and physically disabled woman to remain with a foster family despite concerns about sexual abuse. 16 years of systemic failures of the state. This was either gross incompetence, or people just did not want to know, or simply just looked the other way. The report also charts various concerns that were flagged about her condition over these years, and the discussions among social care staff about her case. In 1995, for example, her hips and arms were found to be bruised, and while in day service she completely stripped herself for no apparent reason. Her behaviour was described as chaotic, and she took to headbutting other trainees. There was no evidence that this bruising or these concerns were investigated back at the time, Minister. And during research and in preparation for these statements, I was also shocked to find out that, and I was shocked, but I don't think I was surprised, that some of the people entrusted by the state to care for Grace could remain still working for the HSE. We must not see a circling of the wagons as we have seen in the past. It's simple. Those who were responsible must be held accountable. If they are not, we've simply learned nothing. If they are not, then the state will have failed Grace again. And I asked myself, and I said already, could a situation like this arise again? The system still remains too chaotic and is still not working. There never seems to be accountability, and people need to be held account. This needs to be put in place. The system itself still does not work. There are still too many changes of social workers in and out of children's lives, and this leads to a very little continuum of care, particularly for young children. There are too many gaps in the system, Minister, still, and when there are gaps, vulnerable people simply fall through them. And this is where we need the safeguard measures in place to make sure situations like Grace never happens again. As I said, there must be accountability, and we cannot settle for less. Grace should not have to settle for less. Those who have failed Grace and those who have failed vulnerable children in the care of the state or in the care of foster families on behalf of the state must be held to account for their actions or their inactions. There can be no cover-up or excuses, and the Government, Minister, must ensure that all the appropriate sanctions is applied to those responsible. Good morning.
Your rear done.
There's more to come from the Commission's work as the case has been brought in to examine 46 other children that went through the foster home. And we know all too well the history of abuse and neglect in Irish state institutions, and this is another shameful part of our history. It is incumbent on any Irish government to investigate cases of abuse and neglect in state institutions and to provide answers for the families of victims. It is clear to all to see the state and state bodies well into the 1990s failed its most vulnerable in a catastrophic way. We know how the mother and baby homes investigation, how it was dealt with by government and others served to cause more hurt for victims and families of victims. This cannot happen in this case. It is disappointing that these investigations regularly seem to be prolonged and extended, but in this case, this is due to the amount of evidence that came forward during the investigation. I have no concerns regarding the cost of investigations such as this, as they are vital for victims and families, and it is the responsibility of the state to examine these cases and to deliver transparency on the inaction or neglect of state bodies. It is shocking the amount of state bodies and actors in this case who either turned a blind eye, delayed action, or did not act for reasons such as seeking legal advice for the case. This led to Grace remaining in the foster home, and I fear for the similar cases where this may have happened elsewhere. EPIC, Empowering People in Care, said of the Commission of Investigation, it has emerged that families of the victims of abuse at the Grace Case foster home are deeply upset at the highly confrontational and adversarial nature of the Farley Commission of Investigation. This is deeply disturbing. The welfare of the families of the victims of this investigation must be paramount. It is imperative to the integrity of this and all future investigations that victims and the families of victims are treated at all times with respect and sensitivity. EPIC now calls on the Government to ensure that the concerns of these families are listened to, heard and responded to ensure that this is not the experience of those other families yet to give evidence. EPIC supports the granting of a 12-month extension to complete Phase 1 of the investigation if this will ensure that the full facts of the case are brought to light. In light of the requirement for a 12-month extension to deal with the unanticipated volume of evidence, EPIC also calls on the Government to carry out a review of resources to ensure that the investigation has the capacity to complete this and further investigations within agreed timelines. Where the State has clearly failed in the past, it must ensure that all families are heard and receive appropriate communications from the Commission, and that the State does not add further pain by continuing the bad communication and inaction that has led us to this point. Despite the criminal convictions and allegations of sexual abuse, the State did not act. The State should have acted promptly to ensure the protection and safety of a child and then adult who was vulnerable. It will be difficult for members of the public listening or reading about this case to understand how correspondence can be exchanged between Mr X and relevant ministers regarding a case and subsequently not action being taken when correspondence would indicate otherwise. I accept the Commission's findings that neither minister made personal interventions in this case and that the remit of responsibility lies with the Southern Eastern Health Board. But these interactions speak to the systematic levels of inaction that occurred in this case. Notwithstanding, it is positive that no minister intervened above their remit in this instance. The case displays to us that the concurrent lack of clarity about the legal status of a vulnerable person only produced more difficulty in this case. We see from so many wrongs of the past that the most vulnerable were left without support and that the State and State entities failed in their duty to protect, shelter and support vulnerable people such as Grace. It is unacceptable that the role and legal status of Mr and Mrs X and Grace's mother in regard to decision-making for Grace was allowed to be misconstrued, and that the State and State authority should have provided legal certainty and promptly acted when any misconceptions arose. One of the most troubling aspects of the case is that there was a complete failure to gain legal clarity from the State authorities involved to ensure decision-making on behalf of Grace was carried out appropriately. When dealing with cases such as these, it is paramount that State bodies and actors involved in such scenarios act in unison with other State bodies, and that actions or work carried out in regard to the protection of a vulnerable adult in cases such as this. The recurring neglect to take the definitive decision and to act in the full possession of all information relating to a case is simply unacceptable. For so many State bodies and arms of the State involved in cases such as this, it is complete and systematic failure of the State bodies tasked with care and protection. It is not unjust for an independent onlooker into this review to conclude that because of the difficulties presented in the case of Grace, that numerous people within State bodies and State bodies themselves swept this problem under the rug or away from view, as this inaction and indecision only led to further neglect of support and protection from a vulnerable person. One line in the second substantive report really exposes the blatant neglect in this case. The fact that the decision to seek legal advice, including on wardship in Grace's case, was always seen as a last resort rather than a first priority, bears emphasis. This is an appalling failure and would lead us to believe that those responsible never intended to seek clarity in the case or to ensure that Grace was in an adequate setting with adequate care and protection. I remind this House of the words spoken on the meeting of the first Dáil by Tom Johnson, who said it shall be the first duty of the Government of the Republic to make provision for the physical, mental and spiritual well-being of the children. That is the founding document of this Republic. That founding document has been violated by this case.
Thank you, Deputy O'Riordan. Deputy Mark O'Cahasick.
Thank you, Ken Corley, and I thank Ken Corley for the opportunity to speak on the substantive interim reports of the Farley Commission of Investigation, and I thank the Minister too for her opening statement. These reports make for extremely difficult reading. They are long, detailed and harrowing in the extreme. And sometimes in the midst of all that information, it's the smallest details that affect you emotionally and key you into the wider context. Grace was born on 28th of September 1978. She's just 1 year younger than me, and we would have spent a great deal of our lives not 50 miles from one another. But we grew up in different Irelands. By accident of birth, I was born into what was the socially acceptable family unit with every advantage, and in an Ireland that was slowly shaking off its repressive shackles and facing forward. Grace, though younger than me, was born into an Ireland of the past. An Ireland with an extraordinary and dark history of incarcerating its women and children. Anyone who didn't conform with the narrow and constricted mores predicated on a twisted version of Christianity that I believe has little to do with the words of love and forgiveness we find in the Gospel. Her life is linked by that dark thread to the industrial schools, to Magdalene laundries, to all those repressive outworkings of an unhealthy relationship between church and state that existed from the foundation of the state. Grace's mother lived in a mother and baby home in Cork for 2 months prior to her birth. Her birth was as traumatic as her later life was to be, and the cause of her disability. She was delivered by forceps and suffered significant trauma to her brain as well as asphyxia and required intubation. In May the following year, she left the mother and baby home and entered into foster care, but that placement wasn't to last, and she was then placed into a children's home at 10 months, before being placed with a family in North Wicklow. That arrangement, a happy and stable placement it seems, lasted until 1989. At this point, Grace was moved to live with family X on a temporary placement. That temporary placement lasted 20 years, despite all concerns, despite all the warning signs. We failed this child over 2 decades, and it's that harrowing detail that makes up the body of these reports. I don't propose to go over the detail of the reports, but I do want to address that idea that maybe this wasn't known about, that it's an isolated case that just fell through the cracks. The truth is that Ireland of the time didn't want to know, that we were collectively content to turn a blind eye to what was happening behind closed doors. And this isn't an Ireland of ancient history we're talking about. Grace wasn't removed from the home of family X until July 2009, after all the bruising, after she was brought to a sexual assault treatment unit, and not until her mother, who hadn't been properly informed all along, was finally told about the bruising and demanded that action be taken. And we did know at the time. A local journalist in Waterford has shared with me a series of newspaper clippings from 1995 and 1996, detailing concerns raised again and again about the South Eastern Health Board, as it was then, by Councillor Gary O'Halloran, though these aren't specific to the case that we're discussing here. I don't know the man. I wasn't aware of his work at the time, but he took a brave stand in the face of very vocal opposition to raise his concerns time and again. And this makes me think of the Keneally case, also in Waterford. And some of the survivors of that abuse are known to me personally, and I admire their bravery, and I wish I had a fraction of it. They deserve to get their full story, just as the Farley Commission has laid out Grace's. And again, it was an open secret, hiding in plain sight, and as a society, we just decided not to see it. And I think, Minister, that is the responsibility we bear here today. We can't unpick Grace's tragic history. And while I acknowledge that finally an apology was made to her by the HSE and a financial settlement made, I'm not sure how much that means to her, though I hope at least it will ensure the rest of her life is spent a little more comfortably. But we can choose to not repeat it. I've taught children in foster care and met some wonderful foster parents, but our foster care system is not where it needs to be. My colleague Patrick Costello has a record of vocally advocating on this issue, and it's a sector he knows well from his previous working life. The change in child protection guidelines was something I welcomed as a teacher, and the move to make those receiving a disclosure a mandated person in the eyes of the law. There are none of us who should abdicate our responsibilities to advocate for a child or a vulnerable person who is in danger. And as other deputies have referenced, this is about accountability. And in terms of accountability, and in my present role, Minister, as a TD for Waterford, I want to ask you specifically, are there other national independent review panels or look-back reviews in place in disability services in the country? And if NIRPs are in place, What CTHO are they taking place in? Because, Minister, we have a responsibility to Grace and the other children so damaged by this state in the past not to repeat our mistakes. We have a responsibility to shine a light on systems and a culture that failed these children and to ensure that it never happens again.
Thank you, Deputy Akasic. Deputy Patricia Ryan.
Minister, I often begin speaking here in the Chamber by welcoming an opportunity to speak on topics. But in this case, I'm absolutely sickened to the pit of my stomach, having read the detail of the various reports of the Farley Commission. Most people will have a little knowledge of the Commission's work, particularly in relation to the sorry tale it tells in relation to Grace. Nonetheless, it is better that we speak about it in public so that somebody, somewhere, perhaps a care worker or a family member, might hear about it, might read a bit more about it and ask questions. Maybe questions something like a bruise or a scratch, a behaviour or a word that seemed out of place but was brushed aside by a colleague or got forgotten in the hustle and bustle of a busy workplace. Something that might make them think twice about staying silent. Something that could save another vulnerable human being from suffering a similar fate to those mentioned in this report. The report sets out what the Commission describes as systemic failings and shortcomings. In the care of Grace over the 2 decades she stayed in the home, indeed for several years she was forgotten altogether, with little or no checks being made as to her welfare. The report says that Grace fell through the cracks and out of sight. She was placed with a foster family in what was meant to be a temporary arrangement. The Health Board knew that both the foster parents had convictions for theft, but that did not raise any red flags. Concerns about alleged abuse in the home were first raised in 1992, but Grace remained in foster home until 2009. Records show that Grace was absent on a worrying number of occasions from her daycare facility between 2002 and 2006. In 2006, she was marked absent on 170 occasions. Grace was not alone. There were several other children living at the home over the period. Grace ended up with the family because of a severe shortage of residential places in the southeast. Grace was failed by the system that was meant to protect her. The Health Board failed to monitor, review and supervise Grace in her placement, failed to maintain a case file and failed to designate an unauthorised officer, an authorised officer to oversee her case. In October 1995, a large bruise was noticed on Grace's hip. 10 days later, an incident report stated that for the first time in daycare, Grace completely stripped herself for no apparent reason. Other documents also referred to bruising on Grace's body, bad behaviour, poor hygiene and her stripping off her clothes. In 1996, the mother of a different girl said her daughter had been sexually molested while being fostered by the same foster family. This allegation was never properly investigated by Gardaí because a formal complaint was not made. In the year 2000, a burn mark on Grace's inner thigh was found by a nurse, but was not reported to management and the matter was not followed up. Concerns were then raised after Grace turned up for a day service appointment in August 2008 with a black eye. The following March, she was found to have bruising on her breast and her thigh. Finally, in July 2009, Grace was removed from the home after her mother was informed of the bruising and demanded action be taken. There must be consequences for the perpetrators of this abuse. There must be consequences for those who turned a blind eye and failed to look out for Grace. And finally, we need to start treating whistleblowers with the respect they deserve. There is a lesson to be learned from this scandal from Maurice McCabe, from Jonathan Sugarman, from Tom Clonan and Anthony O'Brien and all the others. There needs to be consequences for wrongdoing and whistleblowers need our support. Not suspicion or worse, contempt. This government must enact the Protected Disclosures Amendment Bill 2021 and give a European directive. Garmagot.
Thank you very much, Deputy Ryan. Deputy Shortall, please.
Thanks, Garda. Minister, I listened to your contribution earlier on and I have to say I was a bit surprised that, first of all, it was so short, and also that I have to say I got very little sense of the State's response to this appalling case. And you did take a lot of time talking about the Brandon case, and while there are obvious parallels and we need to address that, and I acknowledge Deputy Pringle here today and all of the work he did in relation to the Brandon case, It's a separate case, and I would have thought that as Minister and as a representative of the government that there would have been a more detailed response to this report. And I didn't hear that today, I have to say. This story, of course, this tragic story, began in a mother and baby home. It's a story, a litany of the most appalling official neglect by the state of a young person and later as an adult. It started with an unmarried expectant mother who, like so many others at that time, and we haven't stopped that kind of approach entirely, but like so many others, was effectively cast aside. The state was not prepared to take responsibility for a vulnerable person and handed over that responsibility to the church, essentially. The state had a duty of care to this woman and her child, but there was an abdication of its responsibilities, as there was to so many women and children in those days. And the complications during the birth meant that, to use the quote, adoption is out of the question. So the mother and baby home had, again a quote, had no services to offer Grace and handed her back to the state. That was clearly an inconvenience, and this was an issue that the state clearly wanted to forget. Grace did not fall through the cracks. She was abandoned by the state. This vulnerable child, and later an adult, was completely forgotten about. She was left to languish in abusive, neglectful and dangerous circumstances for 20 years. There were repeated failures to respond to the awful circumstances in which she was left. A 1996 decision to remove Grace from family X following sexual abuse allegations by another individual was not followed through. For a year, Grace had no social worker assigned to her. When a new social worker was appointed, Grace's case was not flagged as a priority and no visits took place over a 2-year period in 2002 and 2003. When the social worker left their post in 2006, they were not replaced. And that sorry tale continues to this day. Shortage of social workers, and very often young, inexperienced social workers being allocated to vulnerable children, them, hanging around for a year or 2 years, moving on, and then no replacement. So let's not think this is only historical. This is still going on to this day. So why did it take 20 years for Grace to be moved? Referring to 20 years of, again, a quote from the report, systemic failings and shortcomings, does not even begin to describe the situation, and to essentially dismiss it as a systemic failure just won't cut it anymore, Minister. We've had too many situations where ministers and various Taoiseach referred to some of these scandals from our recent and further past as systemic failures. That's not what it is. It's a failure, an abdication, a dereliction of duty. And we need to get to the bottom of that. And you can't blame a system. You have to blame the people in the system. And the people in the system have to be made accountable. I would say that this was one of the key recommendations for the health service arising out of Stauncha Care, where we called for the service, the HSE, to be regionalised, but critically to have legal accountability for the provision of services and the standards being set. We still don't have legal accountability for staff, for senior managers who are well paid to provide services, and when those services fail, that's a failure of the management concerned, and there has to be accountability for that. Grace, of course, herself has paid a huge price for these failings and shortcomings. The HSE has described the 1996 sexual abuse allegations as, quote, a missed opportunity to remove her. But concerns arose before and after that. Bruises, burns, erratic behaviour, poor hygiene, prolonged absences from daycare, etc. Still serving public servants who failed Grace have to be held accountable. Grace's placement with Family X was supposed to be temporary, yet it became permanent. Despite blatant concerns, Mr. and Mrs. X had convictions for theft and larceny, yet they were deemed appropriate carers for vulnerable children. Who deemed them appropriate carers? What were the standards, and who thought it was somehow okay to put a very vulnerable child with people like that? The Connell Devine report of 2015 found that 47 children were also placed in the care of this family. Judging by the pace of this investigation, it will be a long time before we know exactly what they suffered at the hands of Family X. The intersection then between the care decisions and legal obligations, it seems, are not understood or are being or were completely ignored. This will not do, Minister. We need to find out exactly, we can't have commissions of investigation like this going on indefinitely for years. Justice delayed is justice denied for everybody, but especially for vulnerable children. We've spent 7 million on this already. We haven't even completed phase 1. This is another failure, Minister. And unless we have a way of addressing these issues, these scandals, in a meaningful way where people are held accountable, they will continue to occur.
Thank you, Deputy Shortwell. Deputy Cormac Devlin.
I want to start by saying how important this is for this House to discuss the findings from the Farley Commission into the Grace case. And Grace was failed by the state and her service providers. Concerns were raised as far back as 1993, and she and her family deserved the truth and for the full facts of the case to be established. The Commission, under the Chair and sole member Marjorie Farley, Senior Counsel, commenced its investigation on the 15th of May 2017. 4 years on, it's regrettable that we do not have a final report. And my colleague, John McGuinness, has consistently raised this in this House time and time again, and I commend him for his tenacity on this, and it's really, really important, as I say, for this House to look for that. Under the terms of reference as approved by the Government in March 2017, a final report on the Commission's Phase 1 work into Grace's case was due to be submitted to the Minister for Health within 1 year of the Commission commencing its work. The Commission has received a number of time extensions to enable it to carry out the work in accordance with the terms of reference. Clearly, the pandemic will have had an impact on the work of the Commission, and that's understandable. In the circumstances, I support the extension of the Commission for another 12 months to continue its work, but I would like to see the final report into Grace's case. The interim findings by the Commission are a matter of deep concern, as it is clear at the time that the South Eastern Health Board and subsequently the HSE failed to adhere to their statutory obligations. These reports point to a series of historic systemic failings on the part of the various public bodies. It should be acknowledged that the national policy in relation to the care of children and adults with intellectual disabilities has developed significantly over time since the periods covered by these reports, including the establishment of the National Safeguarding Policy, including the Safeguarding Committee in each of the CHOs, the appointment of a confidential recipient, and the establishment of a National Independent Review Panel. However, as we've seen in the Brandon report, Grace's case may not be an isolated instance, and there may be more systemic failures. The need of service users must be prioritised, and lessons learned. A start would be the full publication of the Brandon report, as called for by Minister Anne Rabbitte on a number of occasions. Last month, the Minister for Health and Minister for Disabilities published 2 substantive interim reports on the Commission of Investigation. The first report covers the period from 1989 to 1996, when Grace reached adulthood, covering the role of public authorities in her care and the protection and the arrangements where her foster home was identified, while the second report covers from 1997 to 2000, or 1990 1997 to 2007. The Commission finds that there were repeated and systemic failings in the management of the care of Grace, an intellectually disabled woman left in foster care for 2 decades despite concerns about physical and sexual abuse. As an infant, Grace was given into the voluntary care of the state. Grace lived in a number of residential and foster home settings within the Eastern Health Board up to age 11. She was then placed in foster care of Family X by the South Eastern Health Board in February 1989 in her home in the South East. Grace lived with Family X into adulthood and until she was 31 years of age, almost 20 years. The Commission found that Grace was placed in foster care along with other vulnerable adults and children despite her foster parents identified only as Mr. and Mrs. X having criminal convictions. The investigation could not conclude whether Mr. X's conviction for larceny and theft dated back to 1966 and Mrs. X's conviction for larceny in 1988 would have prevented them from being approved as foster parents for Grace in 1989, but considers, and I quote, that it is unlikely to have done so. This is extraordinary, Count Corla. The HSE was unable to tell the Commission whether there was a policy within the South Eastern Health Board in or around 1989 that would have prohibited children from being placed in the care of individuals against whom there were criminal convictions. Grace remained in their care until 2009 despite allegations of abuse. The Commission found that in the care and decision-making in Grace's case from 1997 to 2006 there was an ongoing lack of clarity about Grace's legal status as a vulnerable adult. There were misconceptions about the role and legal status of Mr. and Mrs. X and Grace's mother with respect to decision-making for Grace, and there was ongoing confusion and misunderstanding about what had happened in Grace's case in 1996. There was an ongoing failure to seek legal advice or to follow through on the wardship and inconsistent approach to monitoring failures in information sharing, working with incomplete information and an absence of proper supervision and oversight. The Commission found paralysis around the interconnection between care decisions and legal considerations, a lack of coordination and follow-through, and delay in indecisions and U-turns. Failings in her care and overarching systemic issues affecting Grace's case, and I quote again, resulted in her case disappearing from view within the Health Board from the time she was age 18 to 28. You know, for any of us that sends a chill down our spine, any parent, anybody who looks to the state to give that care. And you know, we saw a programme just the other day about historic failings in this state, and yet we're talking about in my own lifetime, not decades ago. The Commission said that the reactive rather than proactive manner in which the Disability Service operated, together with the absence of oversight and regular file reviews, contributed to Grace's case falling through the cracks and out of sight in 2001. The Commission finds the South Eastern Health Board and its officials were the decision makers. It is clear they failed in their responsibility to Grace and the possibly other vulnerable individuals under their care. Grace has been failed by the South Eastern Health Board, failed by the state. She and her family must receive justice. Lessons must be learned. All vulnerable people protected in the future. And I look forward to examining the final Commission. Thank
you, Deputy Martin Kenny.
The Farley report is a tragedy, and all of it in it, and there is no word strong enough to describe the horrific abuse to the girl known to us all only as Grace. While we finally have another interim report, and I appreciate the work of the Commission on this case, there are still too many questions outstanding. And never mind the questions that the public should get. Grace and her family are the ones who deserve to know what exactly happened and why it continued to happen. Has the Commission detailed exactly why the couple with serious criminal convictions was entrusted with the care of Grace? And we're not talking about minor convictions either, Minister. These were convictions that were handed down in a public setting, in a public court. The relevant authorities knew well about these convictions and yet no one acted. And while I understand and support the process of reforming criminals, this was not what happened here. Far from it. In fact, when Grace presented with injuries, these were not even investigated, and some were not even correctly reported to the relevant authorities. Can we even be sure that this Commission has been able to detail the entirety of Grace's injuries at the hands of the two people who were entrusted with her care. Because I'm not satisfied that we can ever be assured of that. Indeed, it wasn't for those who finally raised the alarm and raised their voices on Grace's behalf, we probably would never have discovered the sheer horror that this girl lived with. And deputies, I use the word girl because that's all that Grace was. She was only a child when this happened to her. And for those of us that have children, we are fully impacted in what that means, because everything in our lives is about caring for them. She was a child who deserved to have her voice heard and her needs met, and that was denied to her. Even worse, she was forced to endure it, even when it became apparent to others that she was living in a situation that was causing both physical and emotional damage to her and to others in that setting. I want to put it on the record that while the Commission found no wrongdoing on the part of politicians involved in supporting calls for Grace to remain with her foster parents, foster family during this time, we all need to be reminded that it was a factor in delaying her removal from the house, which by default elongated the abuse which she suffered as well. Without doubt, the Commission has outlined the serious deficiencies in Grace's care, but Minister, you are now have the responsibility of correcting and combating those failures outlined by the Commission, and I know you will take that responsibility seriously, because we cannot allow this to happen to any child or adult in the state again. And indeed, as others have said, the reality is that right now in this country, up and down the length of it, there are similar children in similar circumstances. And we are blind to it, and the state is blind to it. And it is simply because the resources have not been put in place for to deliver the right level of care. All the time I have people coming to me in my constituency, and I'm sure every other deputy has in their constituency as well, who are highlighting issues particularly with social care and with fostering and with all of that, and there simply is not the adequate response in place because there simply isn't the resources. The TUSLA and the social care services all tell me that they are inundated with the amount of work they have before them, the case file loads that they have, they just simply cannot cope with. So we really need not just a reflection here of action in this case and the horrific problems there has been around what happened to Grace and others that have been documented so widely in the public domain, but we also need to look at our responsibility to ensure that we provide the services now for those that are there in potentially similar circumstances right now.
The Grace case is a shocking and horrific case on the treatment of a severely disabled citizen who we as a state are responsible for. What was done to Grace was done in our name. That's a difficult thing to say, but it's true. When we give TUSLA and the HSE the duty of care for an individual, they do it in our name. We as citizens of Ireland allow them to care for individuals. We hope that they will do it responsibly and with the care needs of the individual in their care, but we don't want to face up to it when they don't. But sadly, they are doing this in our name. We did not give TUSLA or the HSE permission to leave Grace in a home where she was attacked and brutalised, and when the issues were raised by brave whistleblowers, they were subjected to abuse and had their careers ended by the same organisations that they complained about, all in our own name. We have to make sure that those organisations and the people they are protecting are not acting in our name. It needs to be on our behalf. Minister, it is shocking that concerns were raised in 1992 and 1995, and it seems we still have not found out why nothing has happened at that time. The Dignam report reported on the 29th of August 2016, which is pre the Farley report, and he queried why the Gardaí wouldn't allow the publishing of a review in the Divine and Resilience Ireland report. Why couldn't the Gardaí engage with the tribunals and redact any problematic statements which would have allowed them to be published? And he made the recommendation in his report that the HSE should seek to put in place an arrangement or protocol within Garda Síochána within which engagement and exploration of in Garda Síochána's view that material should not be published, and a particular matter can occur to facilitate the HSE making an independent decision in respect to publication. It's very interesting that recommendation, and particularly the date of the report, as I met with a whistleblower about our Grania Court in Donegal in October 2016, and this report was handed in August 2016. And that led to the Brandon report in relation to the abuse of 19 residents by Brandon and the name that he was given in the report. And that was with the knowledge of the management of the facility, thanks to the diligence and concern of staff, but management turning a blind eye to it in our name as well. Minister, it seems that the two whistleblowers in the Grace case went to the Department of Health and the HSE in 2009 to highlight the abuse of Grace out of concern for her safety. And it seems that nothing was done in relation to them either, except they were targeted by the department and made to suffer and lost their jobs on the foot of it. This is a shocking litany of abuse and neglect. Neglect on behalf of the department and the HSE, who act in our name and be responsible in order to stop this savage abuse. The similarities between the Brandon case and the Grace case are astounding, Minister, and I think that's why the two have to be mentioned together. They're years apart, different ends of the country, but the same things are going on. And we still don't know whether there's other cases within the HSE and that have been there, that have been investigated and reported on. We don't know, and that's the problem. You have said yourself, Minister, that we need to know what exactly happened and who is responsible for any failures that may be uncovered by the Commission in the Grace case. But you have also rightly said that it is imperative that lessons are learned in relation to the Brandon report. And I would like to ask you, Minister, in relation to the Brandon report, when will the report be published? And when will the Gardaí be made accountable? Accountable by the publishing of the report, and let everyone see whether they have questions to answer or not in relation to it. I feel that these questions need to be answered, Minister, because they are relevant to how the state on our behalf has behaved. They are also important to show that the state is responding and changing how it has behaved in our name in the past. It is only by exposing and accepting the wrongs of the past that we can ensure that it will not happen again. And at this time, I wouldn't be overly confident that it won't happen again either. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Pringle. Deputy John McGuinness.
Count Corla, I've listened carefully to what the Minister has said and to the other contributors to this discussion. And I have to say that I'm shocked and appalled that what has happened today, or what is happening here today, is a further abuse of Grace and the 46 others. We are completely ignoring the fact that there are reports within the HSE that clearly outline what happened to Grace. Now, in the beginning when this happened, and when the whistleblowers decided that they were going to explain the case, it turned up at the Public Accounts Committee under the guise of the money that was spent on the Resilience Report and the Conal Devine Report. That's how it began to seep out into the public domain. That is how it was exposed. It wasn't the HSE or anybody else facilitating an inspection of what went on or an investigation. And the minute all of this happened, the two whistleblowers were targeted by the HSE. They were targeted in their employment in Widda in Waterford, and they were put under horrendous stress. I read the reports from the whistleblowers. I discussed it with them, and I couldn't believe that this type of abuse could happen in our state. Abuse where a young woman was put into a home and was sexually abused. And that sexual abuse was reported by a HSE worker because he was concerned that she had objects put into her that would cause her a bowel problem for her future, and it did. It was reported to the Gardaí and nothing happened. They called to the house and inspected it, the HSE, and found that she lived there with 3 male residents. There was people found under the stairs, locked in. There was children out in outhouses. There was men of the road, as you were calling them at that time, calling and leaving that house. And nothing was done. And when the whistleblower went ahead against the wishes of the HSE and went to court to be appointed, ward of court, and for her to be appointed committee, the HSE resisted this, resisted it. But she ploughed ahead, and she was appointed. Now, the other really disgusting thing about this case is that it continues today through the Department of Health and WIDA because the whistleblower lost her job, because she went to TDs about the case. That is what she was told. And strong as she was, she took the case to the High Court, and they settled some sort of case, settled that case with some sort of, I'm sure, financial reward on the steps of the court. So we're never going to know what happened. And I'm asking you, Minister, how much did your department pay, or how much did WIDA pay, in legal fees and in settlements to keep Grace's whistleblowers quiet? Is it a fact? Is it a fact that she had to sign a confidentiality agreement? Will we ever know what was said? But we know enough in these reports to know that there was corruption, that there was criminality involved, and the guards or the state took no action whatsoever. And instead, when the committee of this person, Grace, decided that she was going to find out exactly what happened, she received reports like this, blanked out, all redacted. No sense can be made of some of the pages in it, except the commentary that Grace spent years in a daycare centre, attending daycare centre. She turned up, yes, she stripped off her clothes and presented lying on the floor in a sexual position. She was non-verbal. She was intellectual and physically challenged. And nobody reported it. Nobody thought fit to look at the bruises on her thighs, her legs, her breasts, all inflicted by hands of people, not, as it was said, by a fall on the bus. And nobody spoke up for her. Nobody tried to help her. And other children in that house were left at the end of the road to make their own way to school or elsewhere. No one asked where Grace was. It was said she has a cold, she's not well today, she won't be in. She hadn't seen the doctor for 6 years. And all during the time after the committee was appointed, the HSE continued to stonewall the efforts of the committee to get the information that was required, even on her medical information, so that that person, the committee responsible for Grace, would be able to take some form of care of her. And it didn't happen. And if you look through the redacted reports, lots of them from 2009 and before, you will see where incidents were reported to the Piltown Garda Station. I spent 2 hours in Pearse Street Garda Station making a protected disclosure, and nothing has ever happened. I haven't heard one single word from them. And this debate, like the dogs will bark but the caravans will move on, this debate will end. And I'm holding the Taoiseach and the government to account on this. I believe that the Dáil here should insist on accountability. The Taoiseach and the Minister should be sitting down there listening to what went on to Grace and responded to him, not hiding behind legal advice, not hiding behind, oh, somebody can't be named. Someone abused Grace sexually and others in that house. Somebody abused her financially because they took the disability allowance and paid nothing to her. When the committee got 2 boxes of her belongings back, there was clothes in it that couldn't be associated with Grace. They were too big for her. There was thongs in the box, not hers. There was other underwear and other clothes in the box that were not hers. Some of the clothes were filthy. There was no photographs. There was no birthday cards. There was no Christmas cards. There was nothing, only 2 boxes. And when the HSE were asked, do you want to see the 2 boxes and what I've just received, they declined. And in the investigation by the committee, this person that blew the whistle, they never replied to some of the queries that she put to them. They ignored her. and they said that it was a godsend that we have such places to send these children to. What a disgusting way to treat that young woman and all of the other 46. And when I stood over there in opposition and asked and insisted, Finian McGrath, when he sat here, that what he presented was wrong, he was ignoring the 46 and other aspects of the case, Brendan Howlin, in fairness to him and others, stood up and demanded change. My party supported what was to be a lesser type of debate. Pretty typical, because they're wanting to protect the institutions and the agencies. Now, if we don't open up and demand transparency and accountability in relation to this, if the Minister is not detailed to come back into this House, full Minister and the Taoiseach, and to answer the questions that we have all put here today, then we should be ashamed of ourselves. We should understand that we are further abusing Grace and the other 46. And I'd like to know what is going to happen to the other 46. I would like to know what's going to happen then. Are we going to have more rosy reports put before us? I think it's horrendous, Count Corla, absolutely horrendous. And the money of the state was used by the HSE through solicitors to perpetuate the corruption that went on, the turning a blind eye to it. And it happened on the borders of Kilkenny and Waterford. And it's shocking to think that even the red flags from the UK authorities were ignored. Now, I could go on and on and on because I have it all here. But suffice to say that that whistleblower and the Public Accounts Committee, and in particular John Deasy, did an excellent job in uncovering what must be the greatest scandal of our times. And we're adding to that scandal and pain by what the Minister read out here today. And if we don't demand accountability, then what is this House for? How do you represent people? How do you ensure that this does not happen again? We had the Kilkenny incest case. We've had loads of examples from back then, and nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. And when newer members to this House contribute to this debate, and I welcome it, they're missing the central point here. And that is, the state knew about this all along. Officials knew about it. The social welfare, the people in the care of these people, they knew about it. They reported it. And they did the usual thing that the state would do. They employed people that were one time employed by the state, by the HSE, but were now in private practice to investigate. And the investigations were a complete and utter whitewash. Complete and utter whitewash. The detail of this report, it may be okay, it may look grand. It doesn't give any kind of description to the abuse that these 46 people suffered when they were in the care of the state. None. It is the first time in my 24 years here that listening to the two whistleblowers and reading the reports that it sickened me to the pit of my stomach. I can't believe it happened. And can I finish by saying this? When the officials came before the Public Accounts Committee, Count Corla, they told blatant lies about what they had done. And they should be called back in and they should be put through the ringer in relation to the misinformation that they gave this House. Politicians will be blamed for the wrongdoing, but there are individuals in the HSE that know what went on. They're criminals. They should be brought to court, they should be prosecuted, and we should not be afraid to chase them down.
Thank you, Deputy McGuinness. Our next contributor is Deputy Dr. Cathal Berry.
Good afternoon, Minister. And I very much welcome the opportunity to speak this afternoon on this truly tragic and harrowing case. And I thank the Minister for her opening statement. I would have preferred more detail, but I do understand the Minister was being deliberately vague in light of the fact that this is an ongoing Commission of Inquiry. And I too, Cian, will be quite circumspect in my use of language for the exact same reasons. I just have two brief points to make on behalf of the Region Group. First of all, I'd like to thank the Farley Commission for their work so far. I fully appreciate the frustrations of the House in relation to how long it's taking, but I do accept the need for an extension for the 12 months, the most recent extension that was given. I've read down through the substantive interim reports, and they are substantive, and they make for very grim and harrowing reading. And I think direction is more important than speed. I would rather wait another few months to get a more comprehensive report that's accurate and with appropriate recommendations. The second point I'd like to make is I'd like to extend my solidarity both to Grace and to her mum, who I believe no longer lives in this jurisdiction. Like Deputy O'Cahasig so eloquently put, myself and Grace have a lot in common in that we grew up in the same county as well. And while we may have grown up in the same county, we grew up in completely different worlds. I had a very uncomplicated birth, and I grew up in a family that was socially acceptable at the time. Unfortunately for Grace, the lottery of life dealt her a much more cruel hand, in that she had a very complicated delivery, which resulted in both physical and intellectual impairment for the rest of her life. And also she grew up in a family unit that was completely socially unacceptable at the time and suffered enormous stigmatisation and marginalisation and isolation as a result. I just have two brief questions for the Minister, and perhaps you might be kind enough to mention the answers during her wrap-up. The first one is in relation to the extension, and this is the fourth extension for Phase 1. Is the Minister satisfied that this will be the last extension and that we'll be looking at the final report of Phase 1 at least in July of next year? And perhaps the Minister could comment on that. And secondly, is the Minister satisfied that there are no more Graces out there in the system, either in the present or in the future, and that the appropriate safeguards have been put in place to ensure that this will never happen again? And to conclude, Cian, I want to wish the Farley Commission well for the remainder of their investigation, and I very much look forward to reading their final report in July of next year, and it can't happen soon enough from my point of view. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Cian.
Thank you, Deputy Berry. Deputy Catherine Connolly, please.
And I wonder, would there be a little latitude in terms of time, given that a lot of speakers haven't used their time?
Yes.
And I want to share, I actually feel nauseated. I want to thank Deputy McGuinness. We didn't think it was appropriate, given the profound nature of the disability and what's happened and the abuse, to give you a round of applause, but you certainly deserve it. And I actually feel nauseated myself, and I was on the Public Accounts Committee following your very good work and the work of the committee, and Deputy Deasy and Deputy Fleming was chairperson at the time. And it is testimony to your creativity and the creativity of the committee that you found a way to get the whistleblowers before the committee, and then we actually heard the whistleblowers as well, and it's something that has never left me. So thank you. The costs of the Farley Commission today are just over 5,600,000, to be precise, 5,640,451.97 euro. And we still don't know one of the primary terms of reference, the result of that, the actual care and the abuse received by Grace. We don't know about the treatment of the whistleblowers that have been mentioned and their allegations that there was suppression of these events, and we don't know anything about how they were punished as a result of coming forward. On page 4 of the number 2 report, we are informed that principal tasks remain, and that the report, no indication when the report will be completed. And there's a reference to previous reports, 8 interim reports, all of which have been published. Indeed, they have not. I'm aware of 5. I can get 5, not the other 3. Now, Minister, I know you're a hands-on Minister, and I know your heart is in the right place and you work very hard, but this speech today is an insult. It's an insult to the Dáil, and it's an insult to Grace and the 46 other children. At the very least, I would have expected the Senior Minister to be here, given the gravity of the topic, and also that it would have been set out what actually the 2 substantial interim reports, separate from the other 8, are actually saying to date, and given us the reasons why 3 of the other 8 haven't been published, and given us a date for the completion of the Farley report, at the very least, setting out the findings to date. And as Deputy McGuinness has done very well, he's given the background to this. And the background is on what we know. Back in 2009, the brave whistleblowers came forward, although well before that concerns were known. And that led to the establishment of the Devine investigation to look at the care and the service problems and the cause of those problems. That then led to resilience, which I might come back to if I get the time. And the resilience was to look at the 46 others who were placed there, followed by the Dignam report, or the Dignam report, to review the previous 2 reports and look at the procurement of those reports and the reasons for the non-publication of the reports. And of course, the reason about the procurement was that Resilience was a company that, I'll be careful with my words, indeed, but I've lost all sense of carefulness because the nausea is overpowering me at the narrative of what's going on here. And so the Resilience Company was formed with employees that worked for the health executive previous to that. And so we've had, on top of that then, we had the Deloitte report, which I think came about as a result of the presentation to the Public Accounts Committee. And the Deloitte was published on the 15th of September 17, looking at the money given to the service provider where Grace went eventually because they felt they weren't getting sufficient funds to look after her and they felt they were being targeted. And so we had the Deloitte report. Now, interesting about those reports is Devine was March 12, and when Deputy O'Cossie says we all knew, let's see now what happened when the reports. So Devine, March 12, wasn't published till February 17. The Resilience report, March 15, not published till 17. The Conor Dignam report, the 29th of August 16, review of certain matters relating to a disability service, published on the 6th of June. And it was as a result of that report, the Dignam report, which wasn't published till June 19, but it was given to the Health Board in 16, that we got the other reports. And of course, all of the time, the guards, there was a guard investigation similar to what's happening in Donegal, with my colleague Deputy Pringle has outlined, when there were no reasons for that at all. And Conor Dignam clearly pointed that out. On top of these reports, of course, as I've said, we've had the 8 interim reports, some of which are available, and 2 substantial reports, which the department didn't see important enough to set out today. The Commission was established in 17. As has been said, it was to report in 18. And here we are in 21, 18, 19, 20, 4.5 years later more, and no sign of a final report. Let me just give... Grace was a vulnerable child and a vulnerable adult with serious learning difficulties, and we can portray her that way. And certainly she was a child and a woman that, as of right, deserved the protection of the state, which the state utterly failed to give. But just let me give the human side of Grace. Grace was born on the 24th of November 1978. Her birthday will be coming up shortly. In preparation for a case conference back on the 27th of January 89, the sister in charge at the Wicklow School, when she was fostered out in Wicklow, to very good foster parents who took a great interest in her despite their own difficulties and the mother's health problems. And the report showed that Grace had started in the Wicklow School on the 14th of February. How ironic is that? On 14th of February 84, and was in senior class. And it provides a picture in time of Grace when she was 11. She is a pretty 11-year-old girl who has long fair hair and pale complexion. Her mobility is good. She loves swimming, and she's very good at sailing. She loves all the playground activities, the climbing frame and the indoor trampoline. She still needs help with ball games. She loves musical play. That was the last time that Grace attended school, or shortly after that. After that, there was no schooling and no attendance at services. A psychologist, there are lots of psychologists report, they set out her capabilities as opposed to her, or in addition to her disabilities, they set out her capabilities and particularly the alternative strategies needed given her absence of language. Never happened, of course. And her absence of language is all the more ironic given the thousands of words that we now have in the various reports that have cost millions, all for the purpose of protecting the system even now. The reports are protecting the system, not exposing the system, not seeking to change the system, but to find ways of protecting the system. And that's even more nauseating that that's still happening. Some of the findings that the Department of Health have failed to set out in your speech, Minister, the concluding observations in the second report, ongoing lack of clarity about Grace's legal status. I'll go up and down. Delays, indecisions and U-turns, lack of coordination and follow-through, paralysis about interconnection between care decisions and legal considerations, inconsistent approach to monitoring, ongoing confusion and misunderstanding, misconceptions about the role and the legal status of Mr. and Mrs. X and Grace's mother with respect to decision-making. Let me mention Mr. and Mrs. X, who their marital status is immaterial to me, but the Health Board were at all times unaware of their marital status and believed they were married. They never checked up on the fact that Mrs. X said she was a registered childminder. They didn't check up on that. They didn't check up on the criminal history. And what's even more astounding and maybe captures in another pen picture, when Mr. X died in June 20 or 21, which I'll come back to, the Health Board and all of the caring professions were unaware he was dead until the following February. Nobody saw fit to inform them, not least Mrs. X. And I'm making no finding in relation to Mrs. X, I'm simply pointing out. And to add to the confusion, both the first report, the interim reports, number 1 and number 2, have the wrong dates. They talk about Mr. X dying in June 2000, and then they talk about him dying in 2001. But the point being, they were unaware from June till the February. I finish up just with some of the flavours of the comments in relation to the report. Case falling through the cracks and out of sight. It was an outlier post in relation to the disability post. Ongoing systematic failure. Concern about absences, repeated absences not followed up. The correspondence simply fell into the sand. A flawed approach continued. A further missed opportunity. Grace case recedes again. No system to stop cases falling through the cracks. A fire brigade service. Grace's case goes into abeyance. Sort of left up in the air. And of course, Mrs. X's comment, over my dead body will Grace leave, and then other missed opportunities, and so it goes on. I'll finish by paying tribute to the whistleblowers, because without the whistleblowers, their courage and their persistence, we'd have no reports. And as you can see from most of the reports, they're to protect the system. And as been outlined by Deputy McGuinness, the whistleblowers have suffered dreadfully, and certainly if we go by that, nobody else is ever going to come forward. So I join in his call to have a full and proper debate in here with the Senior Minister on the 2 substantial interim reports that have been published, and an explanation for why only 5 of the 8 others are available. And thank you for your forbearance.
I think in the circumstances there would have to be a lot of forbearance for anyone who wants to contribute on this particular matter. And I just would like to say, as Chairman of the Business Committee, that I think the call for further debate on this matter is absolutely warranted. And the call for regular debate, if that's what is required to see this matter brought to a conclusion, is something that we would also need to pursue. I don't think I've ever heard contributions similar to the ones that I've heard today. Certainly the contribution from Deputy McGuinness and indeed from Deputy O'Cahasick and others are contributions that would have left anyone with a heart deeply moved. I think you challenge us now as members of the 33rd Dáil to do what the people elected us to do and to make sure that the vulnerable are protected, and that this chamber will collectively act to try and ensure that. And I know that there is nobody more likely to support that than Minister Abbott, whose personal courage on these matters are above reproach. Minister, will you maybe try and address the matters raised? Thank you.
Thank you, Ken Corla, and I thank everybody for their contribution. And I do want to acknowledge that my opening statement was scant, and I do acknowledge that. But perhaps it gives me the opportunity to actually address all the issues that were raised, because, and I have to remind myself, because sometimes I sail a little bit close to the wind in my commentary, because today it is about the Commission. So at the outset, I think it's important, and this is for my benefit as much as everybody else in this reminding, I think it's important to say that I am mindful that this is an active commission of investigation. And as the Commission is entirely independent in the conduct of its investigation, it would not be appropriate for me to comment on the substance of the report at this time, as I do not wish to interfere with or prejudice the Commission's ongoing investigation. However, Ceann Comhairle, I would like to address the comments of what my colleagues have brought up here on the floor of the chamber in that mannerism, if that would be okay. So, needless to say at the very outset, I want to start by thanking the role of the whistleblower in this case, and also the role of the whistleblower in relation to Brandon. I also want to acknowledge the role of the Public Accounts Committee in actually keeping this right front and centre. And I welcome your suggestion, Ceann Comhairle, in having regular meetings. But perhaps when we're discussing the Grace case and the Farley Commission, we look at the broader lens, whether it be historical or current reports. So I would welcome, and I will engage at all times with anybody who wishes to have it. So thank you and the Business Committee for allowing this opportunity today. Justice delayed is justice denied. I completely agree with Deputy Shortland in what she has said there. And I want to thank you all again for your contributions. And I think it has been a very honest discussion. And I think it's one that is needed at this juncture for us to remind what is exactly the Farley Commission. And as Deputy Connolly has said, how many reports it has taken us to get to the stage that we're not even at a halfway house. 4 years on. And I just want to read into the record, you asked a question, you mentioned figures there, Deputy Connolly, in relation to costs. So I think it's important for me also to, and maybe this might answer some questions. The Farley Commission's costs to date are €7,022,820.04. This figure includes the Commission's legal team, staff, administered and accommodation costs, and third-party legal costs. This does not include the Ward of Court's Grace costs. They were 442,000. So I just think there's a sum there in between. In terms of the length of time it's taking, I don't think there's any denying of the work that the Commission is taking longer than it should have taken. And I have to acknowledge the support I have had of my Senior Minister Donnelly at both of the meetings I've had with the Farley Commission to try and ensure that we are moving this along, that it isn't left on a shelf and just going idly by without terms of accountability on that. And I myself am incredibly disappointed that going this length of time that we can't bring it to a conclusion, because I sat on opposite benches there demanding that we would have accountability, transparency, and it's not all about a system. People are paid to do a job. People should do that job right. And that's the accountability I talk about. While there were system failures, I accept that. But at the end of the day, no more different that I'm held accountable for the job I do, and all of you here, people in roles of responsibilities need to be held to that accountability too. And we shouldn't be stonewalled by report after report after report to ensure the truth doesn't get told. And why do I bring reference to the Brandon report today? The reason I spent time in Brandon, you have to look at the similarities. You actually have to look at the similarities. You have to look at the timeline on it. And you have to see it started in 2016. And I am telling you that the result of what is out of the Brandon report and the NERP is absolutely brilliant. It has all the answers in 77 pages. And we need to be able to see that. Because you don't have 77 pages, you have 800 pages. And you don't have transparency, and you don't have accountability, and you don't have the various bodies either under that microscope. Because if we can't solve it and fix it, how can we move on as a state? That's where we need to get to, that underbelly of where is it going wrong. And Deputy O'Classy, you asked me a very clear question there. And Corla, as you know, I won't answer a straight question when I am asked it. You clearly asked me, is there more NERPs? Yes is the answer. You asked me how many. There are 2. You said which CHOs? They're CHO5s. So that in itself, we haven't got to the bottom of it. It's still ongoing. And by me laying that out here today, that in itself has its own ripple effects. Because it's in disability. So you can go from Donegal to Kilkenny to Waterford. And they're all different organisations. But unless you know exactly how to understand a person that has intellectual disabilities, non-verbal, in the state of the care of where we are responsible, not just I, we are all responsible for the administration and the care of our most vulnerable people, we have to know that the system works. We have to have confidence in it. The staff need that reassurance that the systems that they are working in and the services that they're providing have the highest standards and protect our most vulnerable at all times, from the early years into adulthood and into daycare services and into adult residential and respite. That is important, and I won't stop till I get the Brandon report published. Because by the publication of the Brandon report, it sets a very clear lens as to actually what is our expectation of all reports going forward. I was not in this role when the Commission was set up. I did not set the rules of engagement. That does not mean to say I will not hold it to account, that I will not get it published, and I will not have continuous engagement on the Commission's inquiry to ensure it gets published. And my thoughts are also with the other 46. Because it isn't just about Grace. There was 46 more that needs to be thought about, and what impacts and implications it has for them and their families, and where was their voice and who was their advocacy. And was there advocacy is the question we need to know. That's the most important piece, was there? So I think I have said, probably I want to just address a few other things. So nobody thought it was fit to ask why. Nobody spoke up for her. Grace was failed. Grace cannot speak. She was intellectual, non-verbal. My thoughts, as I say, are also with the other 46 who were then children but now adults. And I agree, those with accountability need to be held to account. I'm just reiterating some of the words that were said. When will the Brandon report be published? I initially was told that we would have an interim executive, and perhaps that would be within 28 days of when An Garda Síochána wrote the first letter. Now I'm led to believe it'll be within 56 days of the first letter. But either way, I was really heartened to hear Minister Coveney today call for its full publication. I am really heartened with the Taoiseach's support in relation to the publication of Brandon. Final report, am I confident it will be done by next June, was your question, Deputy Berry, Dr. Berry? No, and I have to be honest, because it has taken us 4 years to get this far. And I would love to think that it would be done in June, but if I was to stand here, I would be misleading you, because I've seen how hard it is to get to the publication, and I have to thank the Attorney General for supporting in the publication of those 2 substantive interim reports. Safeguarding and accountability, that legislation needs to be enacted as quickly as possible. I know Minister Butler is doing an awful lot on that. And I want to thank Deputy Connolly there for bringing together the steps of all those other reports that laid the bedrock to eventually having a commission, but also understanding that the timeline of it was a report about a report, but there was never an action. There was never that piece for Grace. I never felt in any of that it was about Grace. It actually was about the state, protecting the state, not the state protecting Grace. And I think, Ceann Comhairle, until such a time as we put every Grace at the centre of our conversation, and until such time as the persons with disabilities have their rights, and we enact the UN optional protocol, we are disservicing people with disabilities. And I think that is as much as I can say on all of the matters, but I will be very open to coming before the House at any stage on the matter. And I think it's unfortunate that the way it was structured the first day ever, maybe, but we are where we are, and we need to now ensure that full publication in a speedy mannerism, and I won't be found short of wanting to ensure that that happens. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
Thank all the members for their contribution. I thank the Minister for her response and for her refreshing frankness as usual.